there are energetic materials. That means when we put them in the differential scanning calorimeter and raise the temperature and measure the energy input and output, we find these spikes of energy being given off at the temperature of ignition of nanothermite materials. So there's another strong indicator that we're actually dealing with nanothermite. So then ultimately, after a number of other things like this, the metallic microspheres that form that also match known nanothermite materials, the EDS spectra that also match known nanothermite materials. So the question then becomes, could this be the same as synthetic nanothermite and have been created through this destructive process? Well, then the answer to that question is, has it ever happened before, first of all? And as far as we know, nanothermite is not created through a typical demolition event. So first of all, we have to recognize that all the evidence from the paper does come to a pretty strong conclusion that it is nanothermite material, and that it is very similar, if not identical, to the kinds that we see published in formulations by the national labs, the Department of Energy national labs. So then, the question that you proposed is not just can these things be mimicked, but can they be mimicked in a very unintentional way? And I seriously doubt it. I suppose that if someone could prove that they could be mimicked identically, that nanothermite could be created through a gravitational process on a macro scale, it seems very unlikely to me, but we'd be open to seeing a paper on it.
Yeah. Yes, I think maybe the people who propose this approach should do some research themselves and see if they can provide evidence behind the idea.
Yeah.
Now, Kevin, what scientific studies are you currently engaged in? I know you've got work in progress. Could you just tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Yeah, on the World Trade Center dust, the paper that I've been working on is, actually I've done a number of things. I've reproduced actually some of the nanothermite formulations that have been published by Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. So I've made nanothermites via the Gage method, a paper published in 2001, and also by the Clapsaddle method, which is a paper published in 2004. And there's some similarities and also some differences between those, but the Gage material is the kind that can be, that according to the paper, can be sprayed on. It can be applied, dip-coated, sprayed on. It can be applied in various ways to objects for whatever purpose people might do that. And I did notice that when I made that material, it did form this kind of sticky monolith. The gel formed something that does appear that it would be a good coating. The Clapsaddle material was more of a powdery material at first, and part of it has to do with kind of the drying process, and the explosiveness has to do with the quality of the reagents. And so I'm working on all of that, manufacturing more batches of this nanothermite, seeing what comes out. And I'll probably write up all that in addition to kind of a comparison, which I posted a year or so ago on 911 Blogger. I posted a comparison called Nanothermites and World Trade Center Dust, and it's actually a photographic comparison on Flickr, which is a photographic database, sharing database. And you can really see the similarities between these known nanothermite ignition residues and these reddish chip materials found in the World Trade Center dust. They're just very similar visually, strikingly similar. They all have these kind of vesicular formations, and they have metallic microspheres that look like they're emerging kind of out of the sides of the chips. And so that's one paper that's likely to come out. And also I've got another paper that is on infrared spectroscopy method. FTIR is called primarily, and we'll do some elemental analysis still yet and put that all together as a paper that that gives more information on the characterization of the red and red gray chips that we've found. So now
sounds
it takes
great.
a lot.
Sounds like
Go ahead.
Those sound like marvelous subjects, and you continue to be amazingly productive. One final question about the dust samples. Is it normal, do you think, to have all that unreacted thermitic material in there, or does the lack of reaction mean that something went wrong and we're seeing evidence of an attempt in the morning to bring down WTC7 that didn't work? I'm just being facetious here, but the question is it normal to have these remnants, this residual material in after demolition?
I think that's a really good question in one way. I mean, obviously, nothing about September 11th was normal, and typically these kind of high-tech thermitic materials are not found in buildings and not, as far as we know, used for what appeared to be a deceptive demolition. It wasn't just a demolition, but it was a demolition intended to deceive people. And so the deception may have something to do with why nanothermites were involved, as well as that it does appear that just typical thermite materials were probably involved, and also very likely other types of explosives at the World Trade Center. But your question was, would we expect that there be unignited or partially ignited materials scattered throughout the dust, or wouldn't they have all been ignited at the time and then, utilized in whatever fashion they were intended? And, I would guess that the former is very likely. That, this is a fairly big operation. It appears that, nanothermites as well as typical thermites require ignition, and they perhaps were not all fully ignited, and that does make sense to me when I compare these known nanothermite ignition residues, which they were fully ignited, but yet you can still see these kind of reddish chips throughout, and also World Trade Center dust particles, which maybe a good deal of them are residues from nanothermite ignitions and not fully unignited materials. Now, the red-gray chips do appear to be, that were in the active thermitic material paper, they do appear to be fully unignited nanothermite materials. But also some of these reddish chips that are throughout the World Trade Center dust appear to be more like residues from thermitic ignition. And so I think the answer to your question is it's probably that there is evidence of unignited materials. Certainly that's what our paper shows, and then also probably that there are residues that can be demonstrated to be the remainder from thermitic ignitions scattered throughout the dust.
Okay, great. That's excellent. So now you folks with this important paper, you seem to have made it a highly plausible case that high technology, military grade nanothermite was one of the things used to bring the buildings down by controlled demolition. And this finding, I would say, really isn't unexpected in that there are so many other lines of evidence that suggest that the buildings were brought down by demolition. But this seems, for me, this is like the nail in the coffin, or certainly one nail anyway. And then it seems perfectly logical to me that you would go ahead based on that result and do what you proceeded to do, which is to ask the question, who then could have placed explosives of this type in the buildings? Who had access to the buildings? Who had the means? Who had the opportunity? Who had the motive to use materials like this in a deceptive, operation, bringing down 3 buildings at the WTC on the same day, at the same time that planes fly in and hit them for the visual spectacular effect, although the planes themselves couldn't really have contributed to the collapse of buildings in any significant way, as we see with WTC7. So you've proceeded then to engage in a tremendous amount of research in another area that it's based on your scientific findings, but it's Kevin Ryan in another mode, and really going into areas where others have not dared to tread. And you've written several articles. The general title for this, a set of 4 articles. The series is called Demolition Access to the World Trade Center Towers, and you've got 4 parts, and then there's some related things you've written also that are definitely part of that that body of research. And you've written enough really to publish a book, I should think, and I hope you've thought about putting this into book form. But in any case, Kevin, could you give us an overview of your principal findings from this amazing body of research? Tell us a little bit about how you penetrated into it and the questions you were trying to answer and what you've turned up.
Yeah, absolutely. So you gave a good kind of outline there. The Demolition Access series of articles was intended to answer basically 3 questions, and there ended up being 4 articles. I didn't plan for 4. I only planned for 3, but that's the way it worked out. I wanted to, as you said, answer the question, who could have placed explosive materials in the World Trade Center buildings? How could that have happened? And so the first thing that would need to be satisfied with that question is who had access, who had very close access to the buildings. And there are kind of 3 groups of people, really 2 primarily, but tenants, the people who occupied the buildings would be people who had very close access to the buildings. The security contractors, the companies that design the security system and implement it, would have potentially had the opportunity to access the buildings in any way they liked. Also, the Port Authority, which managed the buildings, would have had the access. I also looked at, though, the cleanup of Ground Zero. So I had an article on who had access to the cleanup, which was not so much who could have placed the explosives in the buildings, but who could have cleaned up the evidence if they wanted to destroy the evidence, which, by the way, did happen. The steel evidence was whisked away and destroyed. But that's basically what I wanted to do was ask these questions. Who could have placed explosives in the buildings? So starting with who had access and looking at all those people who had access to the technologies, for example, the technologies of the nanothermitic materials, which would be, one example would be the people who were associated with the national labs of the Department of Energy. And then who might have benefited, of all those people, who might have benefited. So I found some interesting answers. They're groups of answers, so they're not specific, precise, and these are definitely the people who did it answers, but they're groups of answers. And then from there we can go forward after having looked at that series of articles and better narrow down who the likely perpetrators might have been. And I think ultimately what we want to do is we want to say, okay, we see what the 9/11 Commission came up with, we see what NIST came up with, and those reports are not satisfactory. They do not answer the questions of who committed the crimes of 9/11. They ignore a great deal of the evidence, as we know. So let's just start to propose some answers that might better meet the evidence. So on the tenants article, I saw a couple of things. I started with the impact zones of the towers because I thought that was interesting that a company called Marsh & McLennan occupied all of the floors in the North Tower where the plane impacted and the fires kind of raged there. Marsh & McLennan was this big insurance broker, financial company. And those floors that Marsh occupied were the exact floors that had been updated for fireproofing in the few years before 2011. So 110 stories, and there was only 8 of them that got full floor fireproofing upgrades, and all 8 of them were Marshall McLennan, floors 93 to 101, where the plane impacted. So I thought that was pretty odd. Started looking at I thought, yeah, that seemed odd to me.